Welcome to Multifamily Method, a podcast which explores the state of the multifamily real estate market and some of the backgrounds, methodologies, and words of wisdom from some of today's most successful multifamily real estate entrepreneurs nationwide. On today's episode of Multifamily Method, special guest host Mike Mosher, CEO of Capstone Companies, interviews KC Conway, commercial real estate economist with Red Shoe Economics.
It's great to see you again, my friend. I always enjoy your CCIM forecasts. And for those of you that are tuning into this podcast, I'm very pleased to have as a special guest today KC Conway, who's a highly accomplished economist, having served with the Federal Reserve, taught at the University of Alabama, graduated from Emory University, has written numerous white papers on a host of topics, a lot of them around transportation and the economic system that we're in today. And that's really a thumbnail sketch. But overall, I would say my favorite thing about Casey is that he's just a class act and a great human being. And I've never had anything but positive interactions with him. So welcome, Casey. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And you're nominated to write the obituary.
Too funny. Well, as you know, Casey, here at Capstone, we do this podcast, and our audience is primarily multifamily and manufactured housing, investors. And that's really the frame of our conversation today, that I'd like to get your thoughts on just what's happening in the world overall, in the American economy, and in particular in multi-housing. It will be the broad term I'll use to describe that. It feels like there's just so many things going on right now. And I know you are a supply chain expert. I'd really love to get your thoughts on the future of the supply chain and where we're going as a country.
Yeah, so we could fix this thing in about 18 to 24 months. And what it would involve would be realizing that if we move our supply chain more north-south, Canada to the Gulf and southeast and into Mexico, instead of from LA Long Beach to the Chicago and the inland United States, problem solved. We have 5 of our 7 Class 1 railroads that move from Canada down to the Gulf. We have, believe it or not, 22 ports from New Orleans all the way around to Savannah and Brunswick in Georgia that are in the Atlanta Federal Reserve District. They handle more twice the volume of containers in supply chain as the Port of LA and Long Beach. And none of those ports have even had 10 ships backed up in the past 2 years. So they've got inland ports, they've got redundancy, they've got rail. And by the way, they immediately touch 70% of the US population. So we're starting to see industry recognize this. We just had Canadian Pacific Railroad, the biggest one in Canada, merge with Kansas City Southern, and that'll create the first North American Class 1 railroad that connects all of Canada to the deepest parts of Mexico. That just closed. Go look at the Canadian Pacific's fourth quarter earnings release on telling about this story. Your rest of your hair will fall out. It is such an incredible story. So I think we are a very short period of time away from moving our supply chain from one that moves from the West Coast inland to one that moves north-south with all of our ports, inland waterways, redundancy. We handle more volume. We have robotic gantry cranes. We have, the inland port model. It's a phenomenal story. And I think we're quickly waking up. If you look at Amazon, FedEx, Home Depot, all of these major entities where they're putting their e-commerce warehouses, where all the automobile new manufacturing plants announcements are, like Toyota in Greensboro, North Carolina, or Mercedes expansion of EVs in Alabama. Look at what Hyundai and Kia are doing. Really, the I-85 corridor from Charlotte, North Carolina, down to Montgomery, Alabama. They're all tapping this. They're tapping affordability, workforce, rail, redundancy of ports, and it's going to be an incredible transformation. People thought I was crazy 12 years ago when we started the Panama Canal expansion. And I said, this is going to be a big deal and it's going to affect the West Coast. And they all thought I was crazy. And I said, Charleston and Savannah would become the LA Long Beach of the East Coast. That has just happened. The Port of Savannah just surpassed New York. It's handling more containerized goods on the East Coast than any other port, over 5.5 million containers. 4 or 5 years ago, that's where LA was. and they're now handling where LA was in just a 5-year leap. So it's a pretty impressive story.
Yeah, that's a interesting point you make on the canal, right? Because you still have to get all those goods to the East Coast from a lot of the Pacific destinations. And so do you see that choke point opening up is what's opening up these ports now, Casey?
Yeah, so like a lot of these, you look at LA, Long Beach, they've had over 100, ships backed up. Well, I don't know why the last 40 didn't just go ahead, instead of sitting tight for a month, go ahead and sail around and go through the Panama Canal. They could have been in there, but retailers didn't wait around. So look at Home Depot. They've gone and chartered or leased or purchased. There's another furniture one called Log Tech, and they purchased their own 1,500 to 2,000 container vessels, the old ones that went away after the Panama Canal expansion. And they're going over to Asia directly, picking up their stuff and bringing them in through Port Freeport, Port Mobile. They can go through the Suez Canal as well. There's no barriers in the Suez Canal unless they have a sandstorm and it blows a ship that gets stuck in the Suez Canal. Those little things never happen. But they're already going direct. And what people need to ask, this is my little bird asking me out here on the deck, is what's going to happen to those 80 to 100 container ships backed up in LA and Long Beach? Well, unless you deliver those goods by a stated contract time, the end user, so like let's say it's Home Depot waiting on Christmas trees or Christmas yard ornaments or whatever, they don't have to take delivery of those goods. They come in February and March, there's no good. So what are those shippers and the owners of those goods going to do? It's too expensive to sail them back to Asia. So do they just dump them in the ocean? And hopefully we don't have any environmental problems about that. Maybe the fish get free Christmas ornaments or, ocean bottom yard art for the holidays with SpongeBob. But these are real issues. And then when you look at the transportation costs right now with energy, there's no way. We're looking for the most efficient routes. And so when you can come straight in through the Gulf and go into multiple port options in the Gulf, Port Freeport there near Houston, Port of Mobile, Tampa, or you can come around and go into Port Everglades down near Miami, or you can go through the Suez Canal and go directly into Savannah and Charleston, which are the biggest ports. Why in the world would you waste more sailing time and more diesel bunker fuel at, twice or 3 times the rate it was? So this energy thing is really going to accelerate, I think, this remaking of our supply chain to one that moves north-south rather than west coast to inland United States.
It's interesting because we've seen a flow of capital in the investment sales side into multifamily and manufactured housing, primarily in the Sun Belt. And what you're describing is a movement of supply chain and logistics in that same vein. What do you see for employment trends along those lines of north-south that you just described in the future?
Yeah, so my best bellwethers, my best Christmas present comes every about the first or second week of January when the moving companies like U-Haul and United Van Lines tell us where everybody moved. And they're just like what the census data did in the last 2 or 3 years. They said everybody's moving from the more expensive markets on the West Coast in the Northeast, and they're moving inland. They're moving to the Intermountain region, Boise, Idaho, Salt Lake City, all the way down to Phoenix and Tucson, or they're moving to the South, Texas, Florida, the Southeast states, Tennessee, Alabama, the Carolinas, Georgia. And so the numbers are staggering. I mean, Utah is 18% population migration last year. And when you look at the census data, same type numbers, 14 to 20%. The only 3 states that lost population over the last decade were, West Virginia, Illinois, and Mississippi. And those trends probably aren't changing anytime soon. So what happened is before COVID, we had affordability issues that were driving workforce migration, saying, I just can't afford to live in Seattle, San Francisco, the West Coast, New York. And so that was already happening. Then COVID hits, and employers have to respond. If they're going to have any work done, they got to go to a remote work model. And it's worked really well. It's been incredibly efficient. It's worked well. And so the employees are saying, I can now live anywhere. And I can live in the suburbs. I can live with mom and dad. I can live in a secondary or tertiary market. I could live in Hilton Head, South Carolina. I could live, Charleston. I could live in San Antonio, anywhere and do my work and afford a house, afford rent, and make the same wage. And so that trend is not slowing down at all. And so the affordability was there pushing us into the future. COVID came. It took us like a SpaceX rocket ship to the future. And these trends are not going to continue. So And we're seeing it in the multifamily. We're seeing it in suburban office and secondary and tertiary markets. Companies are leasing and finding secondary office in those markets. It's all in the suburbs. The Real Capital Analytics guys do a good job breaking that out, the downtown versus the suburban. Mm-hmm. Suburban office went up 15% last year in prices, and downtown went down 5%. Those numbers will probably double this next year.
That's an interesting statistic. We've also seen a move in multifamily rents towards the suburbs. CoStar just had an article about that just a week or two ago, mid-March timeframe. So let's talk about inflation. As someone that you know a ton about this topic, you've worked with the Federal Reserve for years, you have a banking background. My first question is, why wouldn't they admit what was as plain as the nose in our face to most of us that this was happening real time last year? And they kept throwing out terms like transitory. And then let's play that forward. What are the downstream effects of being, quite frankly, I think a little bit late to address this issue?
They are very late. In fact, I tell you, there's really only one Fed president that is totally credible, that's been on this from the get-go, and that's Jim Bullard from the St. Louis Fed. Go look at some of his speeches all the way back to last summer, warning the Fed they were behind on this, that they needed to move a year ago, that inflation was real. This made-up term of transitory is, got my famous award. They got a barbecue sauce award. And for those who don't know what that is, I found after 40 years of living in the South, the polite way to say BS or, bull bleep on something is to just say barbecue sauce. So they got my barbecue sauce award for transitory. In my opinion, this is the most incompetent Fed since World War II on price stability. They got their price stability mandate in 1978 during the last big inflationary cycle in the Humphrey-Hawkins Act. And what you have to understand about the Fed is this is largely an academic organization. It's 99.9999% academics that worked into their 40s to get their PhD and their thesis completed, living off mom and dad and waiting tables. And they're now afraid, after 10 years of it being, published and achieved, that to go out and do any real research as to what's going on, because it might invalidate their PhD thesis, or they might say something and get fired. So I wasn't afraid to get fired. I dared them every 6 months to try to fire me, because I climbed the tree, I saw something different, and I climbed back down and told them what I saw. They didn't want to hear that. So I'll give you a couple of good examples why the Fed can't figure. I'll give you two good examples. So I just mentioned the ports and logistics. The Atlanta Fed has more ports in its district. They have New Orleans all the way through Georgia, 22 ports. And they don't have one piece of research or regular intelligence on supply chain. It's no wonder they couldn't see supply chain coming at them like a freight train through a tunnel and running them straight over. They don't do any work on it, and they don't have anybody that knows about it. Number two, look at this CPI indicator. So the CPI is supposed to be a basket of goods. They check prices. So when I was at the Fed, we actually made field trips to the grocery store. We'd go in 2005 for all this technology, and we'd buy a basket of goods. So one of them was, Cheerios. And so the PhD economists would say, KC, Cheerios are still $1.99 a box. And they're now just realizing, oh yeah, it's less ounces. It's $1.99 for 20% less ounces. That's inflation. And so, most of them, the largest economists, they're in markets where you don't drive a car, you don't have a driver's license, so you never know how to finance or what car financing is about, or mortgages. They don't own a home, they rent an apartment. And so now these people are writing policy and directing inflation commentary when they've never bought a car, bought a home, or any of these type things. And so what happens is, after 2008 and 9, the Fed is most afraid of deflation. They could care less, honestly, about inflation, because deflation hurts the banks. Their net interest margin collapses. That's where they make their most money, and you generally have banking crises after periods of deflation. So the Fed will do anything to avoid deflation. So in 2010, the BLS changed the calculation in the basket of goods and CPI, where shelter accounted for over 40% of the basket. And they said, wow, homes are going down in value. We can't have that. We have deflation. So they convinced the BLS to change the mix and make housing just 20-something%. Ta-da, no deflation. So now, the 3 years going into COVID, we've had this rampant home price appreciation. Now we have, 15 to 20% annual home price appreciation in almost every market in the country. And so the Fed has to say, no, we can't have this CPI inflation. So right now, the housing accounts for 43% of the basket of goods, shelter. So what do you think they're going to do by the end of this year? They're going to take it back to 20% and say, see, no more CPI. So I tell people to look at the common sense things that really tell us how bad inflation is. We are going to have food inflation like we have not imagined later this year when we discover that Russia and Ukraine didn't plant 30% of the world's spring wheat crop. 30% gone. The energy prices. Was it 10 days ago, I filled up gas in Atlanta, and we have very little gas taxes. It broke $4 for the first time. Yesterday I filled up, it was $4.99, almost $5 in a 10-day period of time. In California, it's worse, it's 7+. And so the average consumer is seeing, look at real gas prices per gallon, look at food and what's happening on your grocery bill. So my grocery bill, my wife's had an accident, I'm doing most of the grocery shopping. The bill back in January was, maybe $250 to $300 every week. That is now approaching $500 for basically the same stuff, except now I can't buy steak because the steaks are just ridiculous, or they cut them in so many thin pieces that you don't know that you're eating steak. You think you're eating a tilapia fillet or something. And so we're going to see all this interconnectivity of commodities. Ukraine has 90% of the world's NEO that all the tech companies need. Russia and Ukraine have 60-something% of all of the palladium that we need in our tech industry. So all those things are ahead of us. And I also look at things like ENR, Engineering News Record. They track all the construction costs. So we're building homes, we're building apartments, we're building commercial real estate. They pick up all the contracts between contractors over $2 million. And they have a cost index and a building index. The cost is materials, and the building is materials plus labor. A year ago this time, those two indices, materials were going up about 4%, and materials plus labor about 6%. And today, we got to the fall and into the day, it's now 8+% for materials and 14% for labor. The two markets in the country that have the highest year-over-year building costs inflation are Atlanta and Dallas. Atlanta is 25%, and Dallas is 22%. So if you're building an apartment, here's a couple things you need to know. How good a banking relationship do you have with those cost overruns? Because it's going to take you 18, 24 months to finish. You're going to have something in the range of 35 to 50% cost overruns in Atlanta, Dallas, and many southeastern markets. So how's your construction loan relationship, and how are those going to turn out? You think the appraisers are really going to come back? Now I'm a third generation MAI and tell you that I was really wrong 18 months ago, and the property value now is worth 50% more. I'll bet you $100 that there aren't going to be many appraisers that are going to have the chutzpah to do that. The second thing that you need to worry about, start thinking about the principal substitution. If it's too expensive to build, what do? I go buy value add. I go into secondary markets, tertiary markets. I follow that population migration. Where is all that population going from the West Coast and the Northeast? They're going to Texas, all the way up the Carolinas, and all the way down through the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. And so you really need to be hunting, looking at those options, because if you can, the cost to build a new apartment today is over $300,000 a unit. So that's what the average house price was 3 years ago before COVID. So the cost to build a new apartment is about what a new house or a median home price was 3 years ago. So that's going to drive manufactured housing. So I'm a big fan of manufactured housing. The problem with it is local government, falls victim to the not in my backyard-ism, and they think that it's a trailer park from the 1970s, that it attracts tornadoes. It does none of that. And if they knew and took a look at what some of these communities look like, I'll give you one of my favorite picks. It's UMH, United Manufactured Housing, 53-year-old manufacturing REIT. You drive in these things and you think this is a ranch-style home community. There's sidewalks, there's porches, there's carports. They build self-storage at the back of the property so they can put their, yard art and ATVs in storage. They have HOA covenants. You get more than 3 911 calls to your house, unless it's for a heart attack or something, then they kick you out. They put police precincts in there. They do a tremendous job. In these communities today, you can turnkey build them for about $110,000 to $120,000. So buying your manufactured home plus your lot you're all in at 110 to 120. So where do you think our teachers, fire, first responders, our new factory workers for all these manufacturing plants that are coming to the South, Tennessee, Alabama, where do you think they're going to need housing? And this is something you can put up in a year to 18 months, high quality communities. But we've got to get the local politicians to quit putting overly restrictive zoning, to look at how this provides really quality workforce housing. And this isn't, these aren't the pre-HUD days, of the terrible trailer parks. These are really 1,400 square foot, manufactured homes that are built to withstand driving down the road at 70, 80 miles an hour. And these properties don't need the same level of maintenance that an apartment do. They don't need repainting. They don't need re-roofing for 20, 25 years. So I'm a big fan of the manufactured housing, and we got to get the local politicians to quit talking about affordable or workforce housing and actually get off their barbecue sauce butts and actually engage and understand manufactured housing.
Yeah, we've seen a big shift in the quality of that asset class. I'm proud to say we have one of the top manufactured, if not the top manufactured housing investment sales team in the country, spearheaded out of Orlando with Kevin Enger, one of the partners. And some of these places they're selling, Casey, are just beautiful. At the time of this podcast, late March of 2022, we have a listing on the West Coast on the ocean overlooking the Pacific. I'd move there tomorrow. Looks like a vacation wonderland. It's fantastic. So it's not what you thought of 30 years ago driving around. That perception is not always reality anymore.
Well, this new one, I just toured, I was down in Florida, so UMH did this new one south of Orlando in Sebring. And it's got $1 million, community center at the front, pickleball courts, hot tubs, everything you can imagine to hold meetings, really nice stuff. And these things are selling for $120,000 a unit. And so retirees, workforce, it's high quality. And, we need to rethink how we do affordable housing. Kind of another take on that is the for rent subdivisions. So American Homes for Rent is one of the big ones all across the country. And they're now starting to pay more than public builders for land. They're paying up to 40% of the home value that they're going to rent for the land. And they're putting these things in. American Homes for Rent, their latest numbers they just gave me in Orlando, they've got 3,000 units they built in the last 3 or so years. They're at 97% occupancy. They have a total nationwide of 56,000 units they built in the last 5 years, and they're at over 97% occupancy. So the market is responding, and it's the local politicians that have really jammed this up because they think that anything for rent is going to destroy the schools, and it's just, drug dealing bums that don't have jobs. And it's the people we need. It's our first responders, it's our teachers, it's our factory workers. So we need to do something to the local politicians, throw them all out and bring new ones in.
Well, build for rent and single family for rent neighborhoods, to your point, Casey, are just coming up everywhere. There's some nice rent premiums there. I think people enjoy it. Effectively, I have a house without a mortgage, right? And all the things, I have a yard and my neighbors, but they're not right above me. So there's definitely a lot of appeal to that. And maybe generationally, we now have a generation of professional renters that for a host of reasons, right? Supply, economics, and even sometimes just cultural shifts have made people more comfortable renting than they certainly were in my generation.
Yeah. Well, if you think of the millennials, they're more mobile anyway. So when they realize when they finally buy a home that, then if they want to sell it 2 years later, by the time they pay, broker commission and fix it up again and repaint and move, it's a very onerous process and lengthy and costly. And they may not make any money. Where if they're in a for rent situation, but it's a for rent subdivision or a manufactured home, most of these manufactured home communities, they'll take you out. They'll, like UMH, they just did a facility with Fannie Mae. They're the first entities that have been able to get a facility with Fannie Mae. Believe it or not, we can finance a boat, we can finance an RV, but we cannot through Fannie or HUD finance a manufactured home. That's absolutely ridiculous. So UMH has spent a decade working with Cory Booker out of New Jersey to finally break through that barrier, and they got their first facility to do that, and they can provide all-in financing at like 4.5% to that manufactured home operator. And Warren Buffett's done a good job. They own Clayton Homes. They build the homes in a manufactured, controlled environment. So I think it's time we rethink workforce housing.
Absolutely, that's a great point. So we went down this road a little bit. We started with the Fed. I do want to circle back for the investors on the call who they're all watching the 10-year Treasury bond go through the roof, right? As of today, again, late March, it was 235 basis points. That's up about 40, 50 basis points in the last month alone. What tools does the Fed have in its arsenal, and how are they going to be able to stop this runaway train that's inflation right now?
Yeah, they have none. They think they have raised rates and stop putting things on the balance sheet. So let's think about both of those. If the Fed raises rates, so they just did their first 1/4 point, whoop-de-doo, they should have done it months ago, definitely in January. That's inflationary. Every time they raise rates, somebody's got to finance every product, food product, commercial real estate, equipment. It all has to be financed. And so that's inflationary as the debt costs go up. And so what they're doing is normally raising interest rates affects if you have a demand issue. So you have too much demand rather than not enough supply. So they're fighting what we don't have. We don't really have excess demand. We have normalized demand. We just don't have the supply to meet normalized demand. And so we have a supply issue. So how does the Fed fight a supply inflationary cycle? We don't have enough of it. The supply chain's broken. We can't get the commodities. How does raising interest rates solve that? It doesn't do a darn thing about that. So raising interest rates is inflationary. It's not going to attack the type of inflation that we have that is more supply side than it is demand side. So now let's look at the second one. They say, well, the balance sheet. So think about this. When I was at the Fed before the financial crisis, the Fed balance sheet was $1 trillion. During the Great Recession, we took it up to $4.5 trillion. We had whittled it back down before COVID to just under $4 trillion. And in 18 months, they took it to $9 trillion. And remember, the Fed doesn't make anything. They don't sell anything. So ask yourself, if you don't go to work and you don't have a job and you don't have a trust fund, where the heck do you get your money to go buy, a new boat, a new house, a new car? Where do you get that? Well, call mom and dad, or you call some entitlement. The Fed calls Treasury, and they say, just print me some money. So Treasury, Janet Yellen's been there running the new Treasury printing presses for the Fed, which is devaluing the dollar. The M2 money supply has gone up by 20 to 25% over the last 24 months, and so the dollar is devalued. And if you go back to the 1970s, you can thank Richard Nixon for taking us off the gold standard and making us a fiat currency. So we have nothing valuing our currency. And as the Fed says, okay, now we're not going to buy this stuff, and we may even start to sell it, we need a greater fool. The greater fool theory is what I call it. So what greater fool out there is going to pay more aggressive prices than the Fed was paying to put on its balance sheet? And the answer is nobody. Asia is not going to do it. China is not going to help us. Europe doesn't have the capital to do it and step in and bail us out. So if we want to sell 10-year, long-term debt with our fiscal situation, we're going to have to offer 3, 4, 5, maybe even a higher percent rates on our 10-year Treasury. So anybody that's worried about the yield curve inverting, which the Fed raises rates on the short term too much, they shut down demand, and then the long-term rates, they know it's a recession, so they collapse. Not this time, because the Fed's raising rates and they're selling off on their balance sheet or not buying assets on. I think we're going to continue to see a slope in the Treasury, and the rest of the world is going to say, you guys are fiscally erect. So let me give you one last statistic to think about to understand what the Fed can't solve. Every decade since 1990, the United States has racked up more fiscal debt than all the decades preceding that. So 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2010, 2010 to 2020, we racked up in the last decade $30 trillion. That is more than every decade since our history. So how does the Fed stop that? We've got Congress on runaway, print money, fiscal debt side. They got the Fed on runaway with $9 trillion. There's no chance in hell they can whittle that down even $1 trillion to make a difference. And so if we have those pressures that are devaluing our currency, then the rest of the world is going to require a higher yield because we're just a lousy credit. We're like that person that gets, 4 new $10,000 credit cards and loads them up, and they're surprised that their credit score went from 750 to 620. That's where we are, and we're going to pay more for that. The Fed can't do anything about that. They have no tools. I'll give you a tip on one tool that they've forgotten about. Jay Powell needs to go back to Monetary Policy School 101 that other Fed chairs have used in prior decades. It's called IOER, interest on excess reserves. So the banks are required to hold so much capital, and the Fed influences whether they lend or don't lend on that capital by paying them interest on their reserves. So when they want them to lend, like they wanted through COVID and the great housing crisis, they paid them very little on that, almost 0% on those excess reserves. When they want them to quit lending and soak up capital, they pay them more so that they could come in and say, we'll pay you 4% for your excess reserves on a risk-free basis, and your stress tests are easy. And the banks would be the bad guys for pulling capital back. That's one tool they've used, and we love to blame people like bankers, appraisers, and accountants. So let's just go back to the old playbook, put IOER in play and blame the banks again. But they don't have any tools right now. This is out of control. We also we're an import nation. We import too much. And so when we import, if the cost of chips, say for cars and appliances and lamps and everything, go up in Asia, what does Asia do? They raise the price and they send it to us. Doesn't affect their economy, it affects us. Mexico, components for all our automobile manufacturing. Mexico's running almost 8% inflation. They tack it on all their stuff, they send it to us, doesn't hurt their people, doesn't hurt their goods, right? They're an export nation, not an import, but it affects us. So how does the Fed say to Mexico and Asia, quit raising prices? They laugh. Say, go pound sand. So I think the Fed is in a hopeless situation. All of these really bad inflationary cycles end in recession. So you do all the gimmicks. You're in denial, transitory. Then it goes way up. Then you play the traditional tools of interest rate hikes like Volcker to 21% prime. It doesn't work. And what does he finally say? I just got to shut the economy down. I got to have a recession, stagflation. We wring it all out. And so for those of us in the commercial real estate industry right now, we need to be asking ourselves, what are we doing with our assets and with our clients to help position them to weather the next 2-3 years, which are going to be inflationary. So some of that might be, if you've got a loan that's maturing in the next 1 to 2 years, you may be a whole lot better off encouraging that client or yourself to pay the defeasance and lock in a new 10-year loan at, even if it's 4.5% or 5%. That's a whole lot better than being stuck 2 years out and the banks say we've shut down commercial real estate lending and we're not going to renew the loan, or the CMBS market shut down. Did that in 2009 when I was at the New York Fed. So I think that's really being focused on your capital position. Where are you positioned? If you've got debt that's got 4 to 5 years to run, you're probably okay. But if you're in that 1 to 3 year mark, you really ought to be looking at refinancing at these low rates and putting away your capital. Second thing is, if you're going to do development or value add, you need to load up on equity. The banks are going to go back to 60% or less loan to value, even on something like an apartment deal, because they want a lot of cushion because they don't know how much inflation's coming.
Okay.
Did you hear that?
Might also be a good time to sell or refinance or maybe even recapitalize your deal. I think there's a couple paths there to position yourself without a doubt. So you touched on rates a little bit. Give me the golden prediction. Everybody tries to predict interest rates. Where do we net out in 2022 on rates, Casey? I won't hold you to it.
Yeah, no, I told, last fall when we were down around a 145, 150 10-year treasury, I said, enjoy it and refinance now, buckle up, get it done, put on Nike shoes and get it done, because we're going to see a 2% treasury by the early part of 2022. Here we are. My forecast is by this summer, we're going to see, especially with the Fed now saying, remember they said, only 2 or 3 hikes. We're going to tell you what we're going to do. Right. It's transitory. Right. Now it's not transitory. If their lips are moving, they're just fibbing to you, right? So I think we end up with, by summer, a 3% 10-year treasury. And I think by the end of the year, early next year, we could see a 4 or 5%. What's going to be different this time from the 1970s is it's going to be quicker and more volatile. So there's a couple of characteristics in this inflationary cycle that parallel the 1970s. And this has been my forecast since the end of the year and why we're in a 1970s cycle ahead of us. The first is, before every really bad inflationary cycle, we have a ramp up in deficit spending. So pre the 70s, we had massive deficit spending for Vietnam War. So we had that big buildup, then comes the pay the piper time. The second thing we had Nixon take us off the gold standard to create the fiat currency. Third thing is we had we have a shock event. So the 70s, it was a 73 oil embargo, and we didn't realize how much energy comprised our GDP. So we had 50-foot cars with no cup holders. So the Japanese sold us how to have 8-foot cars with 80 cup holders in them. And so we bought all of them. We destroyed our auto industry, our steel industry, all that stuff. We realized how inefficient our homes were, all that type of stuff. And it took us a decade to really right the ship, have energy efficient cars, rebuild our auto industry, energy efficient buildings, all that type of stuff. Then, so what is the equivalent of that energy shock today? It's supply chain. We don't make anything. We can't demand chips. We can't make chips. Why did Toyota just surpass GM as the world's biggest car maker? Because they have their chips in their own plants and they can deliver chips and they're not selling any excess capacity to GM, Ford, or anybody else. So it's the supply chain today. Trump gave us a warning with the tariffs and how screwed up our supply chain was. Remember when the tariffs hit, we were seeing how everybody was trying to juggle around and get supply. So what they basically did is most companies, they emptied all of their inventories in warehouses, hoping that the tariffs would only last 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Surely they won't last a year. Okay, now not 2 years. Okay, we'll get Trump kicked out. And so then COVID hits and all the warehouses are empty. We're empty on chips. We're empty on everything that we needed in COVID. So now we don't even have the warehouse that we can go to. Now we're dumping the Strategic Petroleum Reserve for 3 days of fuel instead of, really open up the pipelines again. Let's use our LNG gas. Let's go back to being energy independent. So I think this is going to be very quick. I think that by the summer to fall, we're over a 3% 10-year treasury. I think in the beginning of next year, we're at 4%, heading towards 5%. My fear is, we're at 8% inflation now. It took us in the 70s. It took us basically 73 to 76 or 7, almost 3 years to get to 8%. And then we went to 14%. I think we've cooked in here where we could be over 14% inflation by the first part of next year. So unfortunately, I think people need to be prepared. I'm not trying to scare people. I'm trying to get them to go back to their scout days, Boy and Girl Scouts. Be prepared. That's what we need to do right now. Be thinking about how do I get prepared to survive, a 2-year period of inflation that's between 8 and 15%.
Okay. What effect do you see on cap rates, in particular multifamily manufactured housing? It seems like interest rates have always had an impact there. You just described the shift that you see coming on the interest rate side.
Yeah, so good question. So every time I think I figure cap rates out, I go back and say, my dad was wrong. When I was starting out my MBA, he said cap rates are 10% plus or minus 2. They're plus 2 in recessions and minus 2 during recoveries. I think it's like, they're plus or minus 4, either 2 or 6%. What's happening is people need to understand the reason we have cap rate compression and they're so low is it's because commercial real estate is a preferred asset. Number one, we're a hedge against inflation. Everybody knows if I can get an apartment property today or I can build one, the next one's going to be 20 or 30% more. So it's a hedge against inflation. Number two, I get paid a nice dividend. I get, a cash on cash yield, even if it's 3 or 4%. Inflation is going to allow me to move that up over 2 or 3 years and get back to a 5 to 7% cash on cash yield with rate increases, rent increases or mortgage increases. And so that's what's happening. People are fleeing out of the bond market. They don't trust the equity market. People were too heavy into tech stocks that had these huge price earnings multiples of, 30 to 50 in tech companies. And remember, tech companies were selling, their stocks were selling on future earnings. So if I don't really have great earnings today, but I'm promising you great earnings over the next 3 to 5 years, and for the last year during COVID, I was discounting those at 3 or 4%. And now, because I had a 25 to 30% multiple, and now I cut that price earnings in half. Remember what a cap rate is. It's the inverse of a price earnings multiple. And so look at what's happening in those price earnings multiples. Cap rates have to go up. And they're totally disconnected from the 10-year treasury. Everybody used to think it was a 200 or 300 basis point spread. It's totally disconnected. They have nothing to do. It has to do with where that equity capital is going. And that equity capital is saying whether it's a REIT or a tangible asset, I want to hedge against inflation. That's a tangible asset like an apartment or a manufactured home community. And I'm at the bottom of the home price cost, right? So what happens when we go into recessions or we go into high prices? Tenants move out of Class A office space and they move down to B, right? The same market. So people move out of $600,000 homes and maybe they get really wiped and they move into an apartment, or they sell their home and they move into a manufactured home and they put half the proceeds from the home into funding retirement or getting, some sort of dividend out of there. So manufactured housing and apartment are in that catcher mitt. They can catch all of that's free falling down their way. So I think apartments, I'll give you a couple last statistics on apartments, but I think they're going to do very well. So there's been a lot written that this year we'll deliver more apartment units than any point since 1987. Panic the multifamily market. It's 425,000 units. We normally build 350 to 375,000 units. So you throw in an extra 50,000 across the top 50 markets. That's an extra 1,000 units. Here's the next metric. In our 150 largest multifamily markets, 146 have a 96% or better occupancy rate. So we have no excess supply. We have total demand that's flowing down our way, especially in secondary and tertiary markets. I love places like, if you can find one in Salt Lake City, if you can find one in Arizona, anywhere in Texas, San Antonio, Dallas, you name it, go through the Southeast, and even in Midwestern markets where we're seeing real strong growth, someplace like a St. Louis or a Des Moines, Iowa, or a Wichita, Kansas. These are great places where, millennials have moved home with mom and dad, or they moved near recreation areas. So multifamily market is not going to implode. They're going to have pricing power because you can't buy a home and you got to live somewhere. You got to rent. They're going to go to the suburbs. They're going to secondary markets in the suburbs where they can get, the rent versus living in the city for a one bedroom that costs more than, going to a good secondary market. And with remote work, you can now do it. So I'm very bullish on the lower end of the housing, apartments, manufactured home communities, for rent subdivisions. And so they'll be able to cushion. And remember, multifamily, it's the only real estate asset that has a fairy godmother. That's called the GSEs.
That's right.
And so they're going to support them. The government owns them. They're in, after the financial crisis, the housing crisis, they went into conservatorship. I was at the Fed then. The Fed owns a lot of that mortgage-backed security and stuff. So they're not going to let their investment completely implode. They'll sacrifice office and retail and everything else. So you're in the one asset class that has a really unique preferred financing mechanism that no other property type has.
Definitely, Fannie and Freddie have just been the backstop of our market for so long. But what you were saying about supply, and we can't meet the demand. Every market that we're operating in, KC, across the country, I feel like you could almost build double the supply and it would be gobbled up. There's people lined up out the door, and the lease ups are hitting all-time records. Rents are going incredibly high in very short amount of time, startlingly short. For example, Atlanta last year saw almost a 24% increase in year-over-year multifamily rents, which is just unbelievable. I mean, you got to go back 50, 60 years to find data like that before my lifetime. So is this a better time if you're a multifamily investor or manufactured housing investor to buy or sell based on all this turmoil you're describing?
So if you're an investor and you've been in a property 5 or more years, I would look at this as a sell opportunity, especially if you're in the 7 to 10 year horizon, because one, your permanent debt, the defeasance is better. If you refinance now and get a locked in rate from a new buyer. So if you're someone that's owned, especially in that 7 to 10 year time frame, you may never see an opportunity to harvest so many jelly beans like now. My dad says it's all about the jelly beans on the table. Get as many of them as you can. If you're something that's in just a few years, or you're a new construction and you finally hit full occupancy and whatnot, if you don't have that permanent debt, scramble to get it right now. And you may do really well, because I think we could see another 2 or 3 years of double-digit rent increases. So you look at that, and so even though you look at it and maybe you're in at a 4 or 5 cap rate with your costs and cost overruns, with those kinds of rent increases, you're at a 7 or 8 cap rate when you come out 3 to 5 years from now. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to look at your time horizon, how long you've been in. The second thing I would say is, if you're a value add, if that's what you do, look at the secondary and tertiary markets. You may never see these types of prices again. You can put 20 to 40,000 apartment into these things, and they're bigger units, and they're in really great locations, and you're in at maybe 150 a unit, half a replacement cost. We need to think about replacement costs. And so I think, when you look at anything new you're going to be starting, you need to look at, where you are in terms of your equity. Does your equity partner have staying power? Mm-hmm. So when the banks say, we're not going to refinance, we're not going to give you the uptick, or the CMBS market locks up, or Freddie and Fannie get a little more restrictive on their underwriting covenants, you want that equity in there. So I would be looking at your equity positions as if anything new. If you're looking at starting something, you bought the land, you may want to sit tight, because I think these construction costs, how do you budget something today when you're looking at a 40 to 50% cost increase over the next 24 months? That's not the kind of smart move to make. That dirt will get more expensive because it's hard, as you know, to find the sites that are zoned and entitled and in good locations. So that dirt could double. And just being patient and sitting on the dirt may be smart for 24 months and then do your start when these costs come back in line. I wouldn't be starting something new today. I really wouldn't.
Multifamily Method is powered by Capstone Companies, the largest privately owned multifamily investment sales brokerage nationwide. Capstone Companies provides dedicated coverage to both primary and secondary markets throughout the Southeast, Mid-Atlantic, and Midwest regions of the United States. Whether buying, selling, or refinancing, Capstone Companies is here to help. Simply put, Capstone is expertise, experience, extra mile. If you're interested in having Capstone provide a complimentary opinion of value on your multifamily asset, please visit us at capstone-companies.com.
Where do you see the capital flowing going forward? We talked about real estate, in particular multifamily, manufactured housing being a hedge against inflation. Where else do you see capital flowing in this future economy of ours?
So there's too much. There's a ton of capital out there looking for investments, and they're flowing out of bonds and flowing out of equities, and they're coming from different parts of the world. So one of them, I won't name the entities, but one of them is a defensive play on some of this activist investors, just went and got listed on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. They are not pro-activist investors. They're long-term thinkers. And when you look at a country like Israel, their retirement and Social Security system, they don't just put IOUs in it. They actually take the money and they put it in hard assets, and they're looking to invest. And where do they get that growth? The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, their top 90, kind of close to our NASDAQ 100, has been, other than the NASDAQ 100, they've been the top performing stock exchange globally the last few years. So we've got foreign capital coming in, and they're also concerned about, the energy issues, conflict issues. I think we're going to see a lot of capital come out of Europe. This thing with Ukraine and Russia. There's concern about, the stability of NATO. Is the U.S. going to step up and really help NATO? Putin, if he's not stopping in Ukraine. He's going into the Baltic states. He's going into Poland. He's literally within 50 miles of the Polish border and setting stuff up. He hasn't even used his arsenal of chemical weapons and nuclear weapons. I mean, they're shooting missiles at Europe's largest nuclear power plant next to Chernobyl, and he doesn't care who he kills or destroys. So I think there's going to be a lot of anxiety that we could see a lot of capital come in from Europe this year and next year. So a lot of foreign capital coming in because they're seeing things that we don't fully appreciate here in America. So the foreign flows of capital. South Korea, you look at companies like Hyundai and SK Batteries. They've announced at the end of last year they want to put $7.5 billion to work in factories over here. They want to put all their EV manufacturing. Why is Airbus manufacturing in the port of Mobile instead of over in Europe? Europe's pretty anxious. Germany, South Korea. South Korea doesn't like its neighbor to the north shooting missiles at them. So we don't fully appreciate the anxiety. We're globally ignorant today. We just don't understand what's going on around the globe and why capital is looking to invest here. And we're a pretty stable. There's a stability premium that we get that the rest of the world doesn't. So look for that foreign capital. I think the banks are going to let us down again. I would hug a community banker. The big banks always let us down. I'm not a fan. I've been in all of them, Wells Fargo, now Truist, SunTrust, all of those. And they get to the letter of the law. They get, it all gets into remote work. What do the documents say? Legalese. They're not there to understand the relationship. The community banks do. And there's some good sized ones out there. And they understand your market. They understand why you're doing a certain neighborhood or a property, or they know that property, and they'll work with you. So I think it's one of these times where you diversify your banking relationships, and I would diversify towards community banks. And if you have small assets that you can't get done, look at the credit unions. Credit unions do a lot of lending. They can go up to 19.5% of their capital. Many of them big ones. You got Delta and a Navy credit union that do a lot, commercial real estate over $1 billion a year. So if you've got a small $3 to $5 million deal, think about looking at the credit union if your community bank even says no. But hug a community banker. They'll take care of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember there was a sign at what became Truist Bank in North Carolina was BB&T. It was after the Great Recession, really during it, like 2009. You could drive down Interstate 40 towards Wilmington from Raleigh, and there were signs up saying, "We're still doing loans." Like they literally put a billboard out there. And many of my friends and developers and owners in the market, they still remember that today, 13 years later. That was a big deal at the time because it was really hard to find capital.
Well, you look at the small businesses that wanted to try to execute on the PPP loans or whatever. It was the community banks. I mean, there were community banks that did single ones, like the Bank of Tampa down in Florida, that did more than Wells Fargo or B of A in total nationwide. They did just in their community in Florida. So these community bankers, they understand these things. They execute well. They have good congressional support. They're good with their regulators. The big banks, if they've gotten too big, they've gotten too autocratic. There is no relationship. I mean, look at what's going on right now with Truist, and they're finally, after 2 years, trying to merge all the accounts, and how many people can't execute. And, they're the sixth largest bank in the country, and they picked as their examiner, the regulator, the North Carolina Department of Banking, because they didn't have grown up enough systems to meet what the OCC or the Federal Reserve wanted. People are shocked when they realize you can pick your regulator. And so the community banks, I think, really do good. There's the state banking departments with the FDIC in something that's, say, in the 50 to 100 million or smaller. They really do a good job, especially that 20 to 50 billion dollar range.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely appreciate that. So when does this cycle end? This feels like the never-ending cycle. I think your colleague in the Linneman letter put that COVID was the reset and we're back off to the races. That's what I read from him. I don't know what the answer is. What's your crystal ball here?
So I think, we were coming out of COVID. We finally had COVID fatigue. We realized Dr. Fauci, he was kind of like on a trampoline. He could flip one way one month and flip the other way next month. And, the CDC let us down. They didn't tell the truth on this stuff. We didn't have all this data in. And that, if you can smell through your mask, it's not effectively doing a good job. I mean, wearing a mask, a cloth mask or whatever, that where you can smell through it is kind of like using a chain link fence to stop the mosquitoes around the pool in the summer. It's not effective, but we didn't get told the truth. But we developed vaccines quicker than anybody in the world. We got them deployed pretty well. We got over 80%. So I think everybody was really looking, that, this spring, this summer, we'd be done. Now we have this whole, inflation story. We have the Ukraine, Russia war, energy prices through the roof. So you get two new dimensions that you didn't plan on. So I think most Americans have almost kind of moved beyond the COVID, that we're going to live with it. It's going to be endemic to us. And I remember we lived with polio for 50 years before we had a vaccine, and we didn't quit working and doing things. We just thought all the polio virus was in swimming pools. So my dad's generation, they never learned to swim because they drained all the pools. They wouldn't let anybody swim. So when we were kids were learning to swim, Dad was there learning how to swim because of polio. But we adapted. We learned how to do it. So I think a lot is going to be told by the November elections. And so my forecast is the Democrats are way behind on a lot of issues. I don't think it's going to be 20 or 30 seats that turn over. I think it could be 80 to 100 that go in the favor of the Republican Party. But the Republican Party, just like the dog that catches a car, what the hell are you going to do with it now? Are you really going to lead? Are you going to get us back to favor of capitalism, fiscal? Because neither party's been fiscally responsive. When you look at the decades and who's been in control, and we keep getting worse and worse and worse, this Fed is totally incompetent. The only two credible people I watch and listen to in the Fed are Jim Bullard at the St. Louis Fed and Esther George at the Kansas City Fed. I know both of them well. I worked with them at the Fed. They've been through all of these kind of crises. So I think we have a very, very difficult rest of this year and next year. And we're going to have to see what gimmick plays out when people realize rate hikes don't work. And then the Fed panics even more and they go to, 10, 12, 20 rate hikes. Remember, when the Fed historically has moved on interest rates, they've never moved less than 8 times. And so now they're even talking about maybe having to throw in, Jay Powell said, I may even have to throw in some 50 basis point hikes. This is like talking like Volcker. So you look at that type of stuff. You look at auto financing. The average price of a used car now is $30,000. $100,000 with 80 to 100,000 miles on it, I think we're going to have a subprime auto crisis where all these people pay too much for cars, can't pay them, lose their job, can't afford the energy. And then we have, almost like a cash for clunkers kind of come back to us type situation. I really feel for those, if you're not making, $90,000 to $120,000 a year, you face a really, really tough cycle. The energy price increase, the inflation price, you can't make it. And if you're a millennial that's finally got your first job and you're trying to get on your 2 feet, like my 27-year-old that just got employed down in Sarasota, there's no chance in hell she's going to be able to buy a place. It's too expensive. The median price of a home almost anywhere in Florida is at $400,000. She found a place to rent an older Class B apartment all the way out in Bradenton, and she's paying $2,200 a month. $2,200. That's a big number for someone making, and she's excited about having a job making $60,000 a year. And she's barely making it. She's almost poor, So I think this is really tough. This is those times where you hunker down, you don't make big, stupid capital decisions. You understand your capital formation. You get more equity in a deal than debt because the debt guys are going to really let you down. They're going to go to letter of agreement. You look at, sometimes you need to be patient with cash rather than deploy it. You need to look at those equity investors that are coming in from abroad. Look at Europe, look at Israel, look at South Korea. They want in here and they want to put a lot of money to work. Look at secondary and tertiary markets. What you can do in those markets, you can't do in primary markets. Even in Atlanta, the numbers are getting, insane. And Atlanta's had 5 major site selection announcements from Remington Firearms, SK Batteries, Hyundai, Kia, all these entities. They're bringing in 10,000 jobs over the next 2 years on just those 5 announcements from this past year. So there's shortages of housing. Like you said, you could build, 5,000 more apartment units in Atlanta and not satisfy the demand there. But I think as you go out, you look at Montgomery, Alabama, just got developed the first inland port for the Port of Mobile, very affordable. You could do something there. Look at your secondary markets in Florida, particularly, inland. Look at a Sebring where we just did our UMH did their manufactured housing deal. Look what's going to happen in a Bradenton with apartment rents. Go up into the Carolinas, look at a Greensboro. They just got the Toyota announcement for EV batteries. Look at Tennessee, look at Huntsville, look at Tucson, Arizona. Look at Colorado Springs as an alternative to Denver in the Colorado market. Believe it or not, it's now a suburb. You're a 1-hour commute. I think you need to look at that. You need to do your homework. And I'm very bullish on the secondary, tertiary markets because that's where the workforce can afford to live. That's where they're going to tell their employers they're going to work remote from.
Yeah, and I think you really touched on an important point, KC, the remote work phenomenon, which so much has been written about, and so many of us either personally have changed the way we work or seen close friends and family members change the way we work. I got a brother who used to commute to Manhattan to the beginning of COVID. Now he's moving to Dallas, right? There you go. And there's thousands of stories like that. My question is, going forward, is that why you're bullish on the suburbs and secondary markets, that we'll just have more people chasing wherever they can find affordable housing and working remotely because they can, quite frankly? Is that the future?
So I think what underlaid all of this going into COVID was affordability. It already was underway. You look at the 2020 census, which is a 10-year view, and you look at the southern markets, look at the intermountain markets, they were having 14 to 20% population migration. That was 8 years before COVID. That was all of that coming in. So I think affordability was a building pressure point. What COVID did is it allowed us to finally perfect the remote work model. Out of necessity, companies couldn't just, push it off anymore. It was do or die. If you wanted to survive, you had to do it. And what they found is we were actually a lot more effective. We were a lot happier, and that what we now need, we feed back to our employer, is I don't want to come back to the office. I do need to come back to the office maybe once a week or a couple afternoons for client meetings, team meetings, to work on a project, get away from, the cat jumping on me, the dog running, or, the kids coming in and show me the latest thing that they did. I do need a limited amount. Maybe it's 8 to 10, 12 hours a week where I can escape that. The number one property type companies are turning to. I have a number of engagements from companies, big tech and big Fortune 500 companies that are saying, Casey, here's where my employees live. Here's where they are across the Southeast region. And they're now all in the suburbs. They're all scattered. They're not in Atlanta. They're not, in New York or whatever. And so can you find me an alternative? And so the alternative we found for them is a branch bank, closed branch bank. Last year, we closed more branch banks at any time, 3,500. We have thousands of these things. And they're saying, you know what? Most of these branch banks are closed. There's a closed branch bank close to where my employees live. Can I lease it or buy it? We look at it. We can buy it for 50 to 60 bucks a square foot, put 10 bucks into it. These are nice buildings that would cost 300 plus a square foot to build. I spend the $10 to get rid of the teller stuff and convert the vault to a meeting room. Now I have a 5,000 square foot piece of space that can have some offices and meeting rooms. Mm-hmm. They have a client meeting, a team meeting that's within 15 minutes of home. No parking costs, no commuting costs, no hour in commute or train. They don't have to get all dressed up. They can come in casual. And they're saying, this works. So find me more of those. Find me 1980 business parks in the suburbs near where my employees live. And so the employee, particularly the manual worker that understands the technology, is saying, I do need a little bit of time in the office, but I'm not coming back full time. And if you don't accommodate me, I got 5 other entities that will pick up my talent. I'm an engineer, I'm architect, I'm IT guy. I can remote into your computer and do all that type of stuff. I don't need to be in the office 5 days a week. I don't need 10 to 15 hours of commuting time a day. Give me all that back, and I don't have to have dry cleaning costs, or, parking costs, lunches downtown. All that goes away. And so I think what happened was affordability was driving us there. COVID perfected. We got all the tools, Zoom, GoToMeeting, whatnot. And now the companies are saying, okay, how can I provide enough space, smaller space, close to my employees so they can get together on team projects or with clients? And look at the sublet numbers on the sublet office buildings in the big cities, even in Atlanta. We got 25% of our downtown Buckhead, midtown space that's available for sublease at half the rents that they were before.
Wow.
That tells you something.
It says a lot. Absolutely. Well,
and that's great for housing, because on the apartment side, everybody's looking for that apartment in the suburbs. We used to say, was it live, work, play in the inner city? Everybody was coming in and they're paying these rents for a 1 bedroom, and you couldn't have a roommate. Now you can go to the suburbs and get a 2 or 3 bedroom. You can have a roommate, or you can have an office and a bedroom, and the rents are lower and you can work at home, and companies are embracing that. So, and they'll provide you the office equipment, the new chair, everything. So I think it works. I think this is a systemic change in our economy, as when the GIs came home from World War II and said, what we saw in Europe in World War II, we're not going to have our lives miserable by living in the inner city or near mom and dad. We're going to this new place we're going to call a suburb. We're going to create this thing called a regional mall, and we're going to change real estate for 30 years. We are now back into the revitalization of the suburbs and secondary and tertiary markets.
The circles come all the way back around. So how about that? So real quick before we wrap it up, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to these days with Red Shoe Economics.
Yeah, so we've been doing well, and Beverly Keith, my business partner, unfortunately her husband passed away suddenly, so we've been kind of shocked dealing with that, getting her back. But we do a menu of items. I do a lot of litigation support, expert witness stuff. I do property tax appeals for big box retailers down to subdivisions and closed malls and dead malls. We're doing a lot of research. We continue to do a lot around adaptive reuse. So we wrote a new paper we published last summer. We called it Adaptive Reuse 2.0, the neighborhood approach, where you look at, instead of just an asset like a closed mall and think about what do I do with it, think about what's going on around that mall. Well, now you have all this density of housing that have, wealth. So there's a lot of things that are happening if you think about it. We do a lot around ports and logistics. I'm still doing a lot there. We worked with Alabama to help them get their new inland port done. We work with a lot of international money that's coming here and saying, where do we go to put a plant or expand that gives us all access to all the logistics infrastructure, the rail, the ports, all of that stuff. So when I tell them the story about, the north-south movement, they're just all over it. So we're doing a lot around that. Manufactured housing, I think affordable housing, we have a lot to do. We got to break down barriers. So we're doing a lot around that and multifamily. The real estate finance, we're already seeing the big banks act badly, and we're early in the process. So, we find the community bankers are still there and get it. So we do a lot on real estate finance. And then on appraisal, I'm a scarred third generation MAI. In January, I joined the board of trustees for the Appraisal Foundation, which is the entity created by Congress from FIREA that fixed the S&L crisis. And so I'm on there seeing kind of what's going on. And there's a lot going on there. So a lot still in valuation. If you need anything on valuation, that's probably my strength. And then ports and logistics, and then adaptive reuse and affordable housing. But I think industrial multifamily are positioned to really, really shine the next 2 or 3 years. Capital will want to come there. Capital wants to come out of bonds and equities and into real estate. It's a hedge against inflation. Don't forget about the principle of substitution, and don't forget about the cost approach, because old existing assets are more affordable, even renovated, than building new today. And so we're back to those existing assets. Go find them, go find the sellers to get out of them, and really pay attention to where your capital structure is, because you may realize that if you've got debt maturing in the next 2 years, you're probably better off having your client or yourself pay the defeasance and the prepayment penalties and get a new stable loan. And if you're someone that's owned an asset for 7 or more years, you're in the sweet spot where someone could afford to do the defeasance and do new financing and pay you a premium. So I don't think multifamily falls off the cliff. I don't think industrial, but we all need to hunker down. Inflation's real. The Fed doesn't have a clue.
Casey, thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure having you. We appreciate you being our guest on today's episode, and look forward to getting feedback from the viewers who see this.
Yep. I'll give you one last closing quote.
Yes, sir.
Winston Churchill. When you're going through hell, keep going. So if we think we're going through hell here with inflation, just keep going. We'll get to the other side.
I love it. Thank you, my friend. Good to see you, Casey.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Multifamily Method. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps our podcast get discovered by other savvy investors like yourself. Subscribe to Multifamily Method for free on your podcast platform of choice. Find out more about Capstone Companies at capstone-companies.com. Multifamily Method is executive produced by Capstone Companies. Audio production for the podcast provided by Andy Go of Gojo Studios, and video production by Yash Mystery of Mystery Projects.